delighted to have Dr. Thomas Abowd with us to talk about the subject of his book, Colonial Jerusalem, The Spatial Construction of Identity and Difference in a City of Myth, 1948 to 2012. It was published in 2014 by Syracuse University Press. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the book, and then I will introduce our speaker. In one of the few anthropological works focusing on a contemporary Middle Eastern city, this book explores the vibrant urban center, which is Jerusalem, at the center of the decades-long Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It shows how colonialism, which is far from being simply a thing of the past, remains a crucial component of Palestinian and Israeli realities today. Thomas Abowd illuminates everyday life under Israel's long military occupation as it's defined by processes and conditions of separation where Palestinians are regulated and controlled. He examines how both national communities are divided by walls, by checkpoints, and separate road networks in one of the most segregated cities of the world. Drawing on theories of racial politics, colonialism, and urban spatial dynamics, his book analyzes the politics of myth, history, and memory for both Palestinians and Israelis. And we're pleased to offer this book for sale after Dr. Abowd's lecture. It will be in the room back there. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Abowd. He's an urban anthropologist and historian who received his PhD in cultural anthropology from Columbia University. He teaches in the Department of Anthropology and in the Arabic program at Tufts University. He's been involved for 2 decades in scholarly projects related to Palestine, Israel, and the Middle East, and is the recipient of awards from Fulbright Hays, the Fulbright Doctoral Dissertation Research Abroad, the Palestinian American Research Center, and the Social Science Research Council. Please help me to welcome Dr. Abowd.
Thank you, Zaina, and to all the staff at the Jerusalem Fund Palestine Center, Samira, Tamara, Mohammed, and of course your new Chief of Staff, or Chief, Zaina. And thank you all for coming today. It's good to see you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book and some of the aims of it and what I've sought to do in it. And maybe at some point after I set it up sufficiently in terms of history and perhaps a little theory, don't worry, it's not going to be too theory-laden. I'm going to give you some anecdotal, sort of emblematic stories from the research that I think underscore what I'm trying to say about Israeli governance, Israeli colonial power, and forms of Palestinian resistance. So thank you once again for coming, everyone. This is an ethnographic and historical account of, as Zaina just said, one of the, arguably one of the most segregated cities in the world. I also study Detroit, Michigan, which is the United States' largest, most segregated large city. And I have to tell you, Jerusalem is more segregated, I believe, between Israelis and Palestinians, precisely because of a set of legal prescriptions and laws that have been inherent in the Zionist project for about 100 years and that have manifested themselves quite dramatically since 1948. Doing the research for this book was fun, but also challenging. It was a wonderful experience, largely because I got to meet wonderful people there, Palestinians and Israelis, but also I got to continue friendships that I had started in the United States, but with some people in the audience, in fact, who were very influential to my trajectory as a scholar and as an activist. And doing the research was about talking. It was about reconnecting with people and connecting with people. And this work, again, which is both ethnographic and historical, was based on about 100 formal interviews, semi-structured interviews. But it was also, and I say this in the introduction of the book, and I'm not wired up, so I'm going to have to sort of stay like this and not start moving around. Right? Okay. You want to hear me? Yeah. I want to hear me too. But what I say in the book that I came to understand as an anthropologist, and it didn't surprise me that much, but I did come to understand that as valuable as the semi-structured formal interviews, sit-down interviews in which I prepared questions, were the hundreds of informal conversations and sort of impromptu encounters that I had along Jerusalem's very segregated and policed and surveilled streets, in shared cabs with those of you who've driven throughout the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 know about. They've evolved themselves in shape and form. And the fact that Palestinians and Israelis were generally very eager to talk about politics, much more intellectually and politically curious than Americans, I think, in my humble judgment, made this whole project very much easier. A friend of mine, the late Graham Usher, who reported for The Economist for many years, though, and sadly passed away a couple of years ago, once was really an incredible journalist and spent about a decade in the Jerusalem area, the West Bank, occupied Palestine. Once said, that, he once turned to me as I was getting to know him, he said, this is a journalist's dream, this place. Everyone wants to talk to you, and everyone wants to talk about politics. So I benefited from that enormously. But this research also involved and required spending several years in Jerusalem and in Palestine, Israel, simply doing the careful work of observation and observing the ways in which the city has been radically altered by the Israeli state, and how the Israeli state, its form of governance, its bureaucracy, its police power, its military strength, has shaped the city in particular ways consistent with the vision of what East and West Jerusalem have been in sort of the Zionist planning. What it's become has been what the Zionist planning circles have largely sought to make it. As one Palestinian once told me, we don't know, for instance, what will happen in E1. We don't know if we will ever have a state here. But it's just important to note that just about everything the Israeli government has sought to do in Jerusalem, they've accomplished. They've radically transformed the demographics. They built 8 or 9 mega settlements just in East Jerusalem that house about 200,000 Jewish settlers. They've projected those settlements as neighborhoods. These nice, a neighborhood is a nice, friendly little place. A settlement is something different. And yet, ideologically, I don't say at all they've won the battle or sort of convinced the global communities that they are legitimately occupying East Jerusalem, but they've gone some way toward making it at least seem as a contested zone rather than an occupied center. And in doing this and looking at both the broader structural dimensions of Israeli governance and also trying to do what anthropologists seek to do, which is look at everyday life and the kind of quotidian details of the street, and what non-elites are doing, the so-called, what some people call, a term I hate, the ordinary people are doing, who are rarely so ordinary, requires a lot of observation. It requires shutting up and listening to people as they're talking about their experiences. It means challenging your own assumptions. And in the book, I tried to do that, and others will have to be the judge of how well I did. But I'll tell you one thing, that a book entitled Colonial Jerusalem has a special task before it by necessity, and that is because in looking at colonial power and trying to examine Israeli governance or Israeli authority as colonial authority, one is writing against the grain and thinking against the grain, largely because even among communities who are critical of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, its siege on Gaza, are very, I found, reluctant to refer to Israeli governance as colonial governance. That seems to many a thing that we're all sort of beyond. Colonialism is a thing of the past, and now we're in a post-colonial world, supposedly. Like the United States is supposed to be in a post-racial world too, right? A post-racial country. But doing that was not just my effort to sort of level a sterner rebuke at the Israeli state. It was, I thought, I still believe, the most precise way to look at the kind of forms of power, the kinds of land theft, the forms of settlement building that are involved in Israeli rule. And also meant going back to the British colonial period and looking at some of the similarities and continuities, which there are important ones, but also looking at the fractured sort of disruptions between British colonial authority and Israeli power. Set myself a timer, which I've done. Okay. And this book is written, again, others will have to be the judge of this too, but this book was intended to be written as a scholarly intervention, but as a book that also is meant to be read by non-specialists. And by that, academics sometimes mean undergraduates, but I don't mean that. I mean grandma, I mean grandpa, who are not, who typically, my grandma and grandpa don't read typically academic books. And the reason I did that, among other things, was, you know, a lot of academic books can be quite boring. The academic books of present company excluded, of course. But I wanted it to be a text that would sort of shake folks up a bit, and that might get people to think about the role of the Israeli state and U.S. imperial power in different ways. So to talk about international law, but also to go down into the street level and consider what forms of violations of international law and the occupation, which the entire global community regards as illegal, the settlements, the wall. You've read about the ICJ's judgment. We just came upon the 10th anniversary of that. But to look at that in ways that are sort of to understand that and to identify colonial power when we see these things happening. And this is a corrective to a couple of things, not least of which is what I see too often, the prevalent representation of Jerusalem. I just heard a very pathetic report by NPR about the tram line that goes from the settlements to West Jerusalem. Some of you may have heard that a few days ago. And no mention that the guy traveling on this attack, that the Palestinians attacked this tram line, that it actually not only crosses from East Jerusalem to West Jerusalem, but it crosses from occupied territory to West Jerusalem. That was sort of mentioned at the end, but the guy who was the Israeli settler who was being interviewed is never identified as a settler. And that is sort of on the better end. More typically because NPR is not what some of these other are not capable of some of these other sort of Fox News style representations or representations you hear from congressional people. But what you also hear is something I think that's almost as damaging, which is a radically depoliticized understanding of the city. An understanding and a representation of the communities who are in conflict there as being sort of involved in biblical, timeless, eternal struggles. These people have been fighting forever. And the city is seen and represented in this way that the Israeli state often propagates as an eternal, immutable capital that belongs most importantly, if not solely, to the Jewish people. And these radically depoliticized representations or dehistoricized representations are precisely that. They are what Edward Said described once as representations that sort of exist out of history, anachronistically. Cults build up around King David. As archaeologists and anthropologists, we know very little about King David. All these things ascribed to him, we don't know actually happened. And yet the Israeli nation state has built a whole national mythology around the city of David and things like that, which I'm sure you've heard about. Israel, I argue, though, in this book is not just a flawed liberal democracy, and it's not just any old, it doesn't represent just any old colonial regime. It represents a form of colonialism that those in colonialist studies want to distinguish as being a form of, and refer to as settler colonialism. And settler colonialism, I argue, has been created here, but its history goes back before 1967, and to understand the Zionist projects, the plural, one has to understand the concepts of settlement and the vision, the demographic and even racial vision that a broad swath of the Zionist movement's participants were invested in. I'm going to talk a little bit later about Martin Buber, the great Jewish humanist philosopher, who moved from Germany, found refuge in Palestine in the late 30s, lived in Edward Said's house before 48, and then stayed on until his death in Jerusalem in 1965 in a strange sort of arrangement in an appropriated Palestinian home I'll tell you a little bit about. But Buber was, even when he had always been a fighter for binationalism, but even when he was opposed to a Jewish state, like Chomsky and Einstein and others who might have vaguely referred to themselves as Zionists, they were against a Jewish state. But Buber reconciled himself with that Zionist vision. But even before that was mentioning in the 30s, in defense of the Zionist projects in Palestine, that referring to the project as a sort of sacred mission that is ordained by the God of the Bible. And he even writes, and you can see this in his writing, I'm happy to point you to the source, that this project of Zionism must be about what he called concentrative colonialism. So what he meant by it was different than what Jabotinsky or Ben-Gurion meant by it, but he was using that terminology, and that terminology was in the air. The early Zionist settlers were largely, they were settlers who called themselves settlers. So we'll circle back to that a little bit. I don't want to take too much time fleshing it out in this way. But what's crucial to this particular colonial state and this colonial project is very, very kind of distinguished colonial racism and forms of legal discrimination and housing, discriminatory housing policies that are pretty apparent, I would argue, and that don't that are pretty at times explicit or implicit in Israeli laws and policies, in public discourse, from everyone from Netanyahu to the Meretz Party, talking about the anxieties about too many Palestinians, essentially. Demographic dangers, demographic time bombs. This is not just the discourse of the foreign minister who is full of, the Israeli foreign minister is full of nice, lovely statements of late. But really, if you talk to people in the Meretz Party, that is the far left Israeli Zionist party, you hear the same sort of concerns. Yes, the best of the most progressive say, yes, Palestinians deserve equality and rights, but separate from us. We have to have a kind of a separation. And yes, they can be in Jerusalem, but we ought to live apart. So this machinery of apartheid-like racism became more apparent when I lived under this form of governance and spoke to Palestinians and many progressive Israelis. I'll talk about one in a few moments, who were Israeli Jews, but who were very much in opposition to what their government, Labor, Likud, it didn't matter, were up to in terms of colonizing the former Palestine. Settler colonialism then is in the language of the literature. It distinguishes itself because it has what Patrick Wolf calls a logic of elimination. That is, it's not like the British in India or Kenya necessarily. It's at all, actually. It's more like the French rule in Algeria, where the idea was to, and even different from that, but along those lines, to settle people and replace one people who are living there with another group of settlers. It's not based on the conquest of land and the expropriation or the exploitation of the labor. It's more that this kind of regime just wants the indigenous population out. They're not even interested in necessarily exploiting the labor. Hebrew labor, avodah ivrit, I believe in Hebrew, is the idea of Jewish or Hebrew labor being the basis for this project. So here are some, just to run through the maps a bit. So I don't have every map I wanted, but this is Jerusalem between 48 and 67, after the 48 war, in which Israel conquered West Jerusalem. About 98% of the Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian population of the west side were expelled, maybe more. The east side came under Jordanian rule for that time period, and a lined ironclad wall, the first of the walls or separation divides between the city, were erected. After in the 67 war, when Israel conquered the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, the Sinai, East Jerusalem, this is among the first things the Israeli state did, and this speaks to the kind of bureaucratic dimensions of that are linked to racial designs and racial policies, was to redraw the boundaries of Jerusalem and expand them tenfold, from roughly 7 square kilometers to, which is the Jordanian-defined city, to 70 square kilometers. And this is what in June of 1967, the new boundaries were meant to be. They were drawn in a way that spoke to the principle that honored the Israeli principle of maximum amount of land, minimum amount of Palestinian people. And planners, former planners who were involved in this, Maren Ben-Benistes, the late Sarah Kamenkar, and others have been very explicit that this was and is, in fact, today, as we'll get to when we look at the course of the wall, the principle. Take in as much Palestinian empty land as you can, but leave the Palestinian people on the other side. A strictly racial and I would say racist vision, but that is the operating logic of this regime. And again, not just since 67. One can see this inside within the 49 armistice lines as well. To this day, Israeli land laws stipulate through a sophisticated, circuitous legal set of tactics that about 9/10 of the land of Israel that's within the 49 armistice lines, that is roughly its international boundaries, is administered by the bylaws of the Jewish National Fund. And the Jewish National Fund bylaws are exclusionary. They state the JNF does not own this land, but they own some of it, and they manage all of the state land, or most of the state land as I understand it. And their bylaws say that this land is to be used for the exclusive use and benefit of Jews only. Non-Jews may neither own this land or lease it long term. And this makes the vast majority of Israeli land off limits to Palestinian Christians and Muslims and other non-Jews, although not the so-called Russian Jews, a third of which Ian Lustig points out at the conference here a few weeks ago. About 300,000 of the so-called Russian Jews are not Jewish and don't pretend to be. He got involved, and this is a side issue, but it's an important issue. But for the sake of demographic politics, they've been counted by the Israeli state as Jewish. Palestinian Russian Orthodox complain that their Russian Orthodox churches are full on Sunday with Russian Jews. So, at any rate, that's a side issue. But what I really wanted to get at, following Talal Asad, who is a brilliant anthropologist and someone I was deeply influenced by, was to understand colonialism then, not necessarily in the way it functions in the popular imagination, not as sort of sheer power and coercion and force and torture and bulldozers and walls. That's all part of it. But as Assad says, colonialism has to be understood as not as a temporary repression of subject populations, but an irrevocable process of transmutation in which old desires and ways of life were destroyed or are destroyed, and new ones take their place. And part of that, and what I want to talk a little bit about now, so here's the city. Let me just interlude a bit. So you have the original boundaries drawn in '67, but what's now becoming? But these are not walled off. But now with the creation of the wall, and the wall in Jerusalem is a wall. The barrier is not a fence or a picket fence, as some of the State Department make it sound like, but actually a concrete wall, which is almost completely has completely surrounded Jerusalem and is intended to take in Ma'ale Adumim, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And what's happening is that even the Israeli boundaries drawn in '67 are now being altered to leave out populations of Palestinians in Kufr Aqab, Shafat refugee camp. There are something like, Salim Tamari can tell me us more accurately, but something like 60,000 Palestinians who have Israeli residency permits to be in Jerusalem, who are now finding themselves, because the Israeli state would rather not have them as a demographic danger, on the other side of this wall. But yet they have the right to be in Jerusalem. And this is creating, as you can imagine, why else do you draw boundaries in the formal concretized version of this boundary, borders like this, if you don't have a racial vision and a notion that certain people are the wrong kind of, certain people belong here and certain people are demographic dangers and are not welcome here. But colonialism, what I also want to emphasize is that I read it as also importantly, beyond all this concrete and fortressing, also a cultural project of control too. Colonial dominance is solidified through ideological means, and as a cultural project of control, it does a range of very creative and productive things, to morally neutral terms, with ideas of myth, biblical myth, but other more recently constituted national ideas. The Jewish National Fund, this is a poster that's been collected in a wonderful series of posters about Palestine and Palestine-Israel, has always emphasized, the just mentioned JNF, that the project for this organization is to redeem the land, reclaim the land. In Hebrew, there are a couple different words they use. I'm not a student of Hebrew. I have elementary knowledge of it. But this whole idea of going back, redeeming, reclaiming, should cause worry in one's mind, but it's mythical for one. Reasons we can talk about and unpack a little bit. But it also is effective in mobilizing support for the project and blunting resistance to intrusions onto the land. If you do believe this is God's bequest to the Jewish people and no others have a claim here, even if you're a Jewish individual in the United States and you've never been there, you have a greater claim than the Palestinians, then the ideological work has functioned and done its job. And this I refer to as what I call the weaponization of myth, which we can talk a little bit more about below in just a few moments. I'm going to set the time so I don't go over. I'm cognizant of this, by the way. I'm cognizant that I have a problem with going over. So among these myths was sort of I was surprised to hear that among these myths were biblical ideas that have according to many Israeli activists that I met, permeated a lot of secular thinking, or at least a lot of secular thinking's discourse. And my friend and former editor, the brilliant Israeli leftist and anti-Zionist scholar Tikva Honig-Parnas, who I recommend you all go out and get her wonderful book, False Prophets of Peace, she fought in the Palmach, in the Haganah, and she tells the story of growing up in Israel, she being a very secular person, involved, very always secular, part of the secular, like left Zionist tradition. But she describes growing up in Israel a situation where in even secular schools, the Bible was taught as history 5 times a day, 5 times a week. And that this was, young students were marched around the country and biblical references were used to describe and to emphasize and point out why this is their heritage. This is God's bequest to them. And she also relates this I thought, quite interesting story that I talk about on page 22. I'll just read it. Basically, she's now a grandmother. Her grandson's in a secular North Tel Aviv primary, 8th grade, whatever they called it, there. And at graduation, a young boy was tasked with coming up before the graduation and reading the line from Genesis 13, 14, 17. The Lord said to Abraham after Lot had parted from him, "Please raise your eyes and see from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your seed to eternity." Now, this claim that the land of Israel is a part of a kind of celestial real estate guide whose listings can only be acquired by members of one religious group has been deployed in innumerable ways in secular education, out of the words of what I understand was a very secular politician, Ehud Olmert, but he would always talk about these sort of biblical connections, apparently knowing that they're mythical, or not believing himself that they're mythical. But this is what I wanted to get at in the book, trying to sort of pull out and challenge these ideas, which link up with identity and space and discrimination and racism as well. I begin the book with a story of, let me turn to this in the interest of time, I'll cut a little bit, but I begin this book with a tale of cultural violence and negation by the Israeli state that really has, to this day, become very difficult for me to fathom, and that is the creation of the so-called Museum of Tolerance, funded by the enormously economically potent organization, the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. And for those not familiar, many of you are, it's an institution, a very grand museum that's meant to build peace and heal the landscape of this scarred, fractured city. But in fact, as those who know a bit about it will know, that it's chosen as its site one part of a 100-year-old Muslim cemetery just outside the Jaffa Gate, the old city walls to the west, the Mamilla Islamic Cemetery. And this is a picture of it in 1920. This is not the picture of the part of the cemetery where the Museum of Tolerance is going to be built, but it is going to be built there. And in the course of well, let me just tell you that in the course of actually finding the site and laying the foundation, those who were involved in the actual construction were compelled to acknowledge that they had dug up bones of the remains of of people interred, or what's the term, buried there. Now, the response was an interesting one, and consistent with some of the discourses the Israeli state has mobilized to defend actions that are this egregious, including the assertion that this was not a real cemetery and these were fake graves. And it's interesting to note, if you go back and look at the British colonial period, but also at earlier Zionist maps from different Zionist organizations, the cemetery appears long before 48. It's acknowledged and sort of represented on nearly all cartographic representations of the city. This is not a fake cemetery, nor is it there are many arguments for why the museum should go forward. And it now is moving forward with the sanction of a Supreme Court ruling, I believe in 2008, that declares it lawful and further denigrates the heritage of those families in the city and who have passed away, who have some connection to this, and for whom this is an important space. This is the inside of the museum as it's being configured. These are these kind of contraband images because, in fact, Israel and whoever's involved in the construction project has built a mammoth wall around the project that kind of doesn't look unlike this kind of turret in the making around the project, so people can't actually look in very easily at what's going on. What's interesting about colonial discourse, and I would argue in this part of Jerusalem in particular, is that those who were even those who were in opposition and could level a really solid critique of what the Wiesenthal Center and the Israeli municipality are doing, were often unaware that, because the defense was, well, this is part of an Israeli park. Yes, there's a cemetery over there, but this is part of an Israeli park, and we're building on what was a parking garage. And those who sent letters of opposition to the Wiesenthal Center got back this high-res image of a parking lot, and they said, this is where we're building it. Well, on the site of this empty parking lot, what they had to do to perform that contortion of that sort of ideological contortion was to not say that the parking lot itself was paved over another part of the cemetery in the 50s, and that the the Independence Park, the Hebrew is the Independence Park that was established in the 50s and 60s is paved over the other part of the older cemetery. And so those contesting it today, it's sort of emblematic, I argue, for what's happening in Jerusalem today. There's plenty of opposition, and a very intelligent opposition to what Israel is doing in East Jerusalem. But so much is lost, so much seems to me to be lost in terms of a critique of what has already been paved over, what has already been taken in West Jerusalem. And that sort of colonial layering, as I call it, that's happening. Now, many Arab cemeteries, Palestinian cemeteries, have been plowed under since 1948 in the course of depopulating or destroying about 400 villages in the early years of the new Israeli state. Many cemeteries, not maybe 400, but many others were destroyed in villages that were destroyed and populated. I came across others in the Jerusalem area alone, and these included a former burial site in the depopulated Palestinian village of Sheikh Badr, which is just to the west of the museum. It's a few kilometers to the west of the site that I just showed you. And it was a former Palestinian village, but today it's known as Gan Saker Sacher, the garden, the Saker Garden or Saker Park. And it's today used, particularly the large green area for those who've been there. The village sort of was in this space, and this was an area where crops were grown apparently, and the village sort of goes into the foothills above it, where the Knesset is also built. The Knesset was built apparently partially on the land of this village too. I was invited to walk through the park a few years ago when I was last in Jerusalem with an Israeli friend, a well-known radical activist in Israel, Jeff Halper, the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And he wanted to show me the remains of this village, the traces that were left, the cemetery in particular. And we walked through. It wasn't as crowded as this on the day we went. And as we looked for this, he didn't know exactly where it was. He hadn't been there for a couple of years, though he lives right near this now park. He insisted that not far ahead we'd find the last remains of the village. And we plowed through brush under the tall pine trees now everywhere around us. We were up in this area. We're walking up the hill, not far from the back entrance of Knesset. And he couldn't find the burial site. and it seemed to have been gradually gotten rid of. He was convinced it was there, and we couldn't find it for half an hour, 45 minutes, but he was convinced there was a kind of a remains of a stone platform that might have been the part of the former cemetery. But in the years he had between our visit and the time he had last been, he was convinced that the last part of the cemetery had been eliminated. As we were fanning out in search of it, though, suddenly a loud shh was heard from behind a group of trees. We had apparently stumbled unwittingly onto an Israeli nature preserve for rare bird species, now located in the land of the destroyed village. The staff person was irate, and as we gave up on finding the Arab cemetery and walked toward him and sort of out of the park, there was a sign in Hebrew that instructed those who ambled through these foothills and just below the Knesset not to disturb the birds. And that's what he was upset about. But critically and symbolically, it was I think, a very important injunction to silence the past, to very symbolically. He didn't know what we were up to. All he knew is we were disturbing birds. But there's something very, I think, emblematic of that story. The idea that any search for effort to uncover or unearth destroyed pasts, destroyed cemeteries, negated histories are to be contested. And you see this in Jerusalem all the time and in many, many different places. Many decades ago, about 10 years before Israel was established and the Palestinians were expelled, the great thinker and theorist Walter Benjamin asserted that, quote, only that historian will give the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. Now, Benjamin's talking about fascism in Europe. They're not clear parallel, but there is some. The enemies of which he speaks are found in and among the Israeli political elite and bureaucratic planning circles that seek to negate and replace not just populations but histories and stories of the past. This weaponization of myth and history is also found, and by the way, I'll skip to because I'm running out of time. Sheikh Badr is mentioned. It's not much mentioned in the Israeli in public discourse or in text or what have you, but it is mentioned one place that I found directly. There was a destroyed village, that is. This is a plaque, a series of blue plaques the Israeli municipality put up all over West Jerusalem. And they're monuments or memorials, something that I also write about in this text, to the Haganah, the Stern Gang, Etzel, the Irgun, paramilitary forces, pre-48 forces that became the Israeli Defense Forces, and which are marked off, and this is on the side of a Palestinian appropriated home, the Gemel House in Tolvia, not denoting this as a home that once belonged to a Palestinian family, not mentioning Sheikh Badr as a destroyed village, but in memory of the head of the Stern Gang, who sort of unwittingly blew himself up when he was putting some explosives together in the backyard of this home that had been taken over by the new Israeli state. And it reads, if you can't see, Machani Dror's headquarters acted as Lahi, or Stern Gang headquarters, misspelled, and housed their arms, ammunition, and their explosives industry. This structure was named in memory of Mordechai Dror, who fell during the liberation of Sheikh Badr, meaning the expulsion of the Palestinians in early 48. Here, a tragic explosion claimed the lives of the 5 of the finest Lahi freedom fighters. And so this is the kind of marking, the kind of ideology that exists in the world, that exists and is sort of inscribed on areas of the city, not just West, but East Jerusalem, that are memorialized, but that are meant to tell different stories than the stories of dispossession, which they nearly always have entailed. Benjamin's statement on memory in the past is crucial to the contest over this colonized city. And this work looks at how religious and nationalist myths are melded and merged together to facilitate the conquest of some of the most vital places in this deeply symbolic urban center. Let me just tell you about one, and this is a picture that's actually also the cover of my book, which was taken, I believe, in the 20s or 30s, and it's taken of a 700-year-old Palestinian Arab neighborhood, mostly Muslim, that for 700 years existed before the Kotel, or the Western Wall, and was destroyed in 1967 by the new Israeli occupation forces, which before even redrawing the boundaries of the city in the first few days of the occupation, in one night, with 3 hours notice, expelled the 700, 600, 800 residents of this neighborhood, poor neighborhood, and demolished it and expelled them and put them on buses and sent them out to exist elsewhere. They destroyed about 135 homes and masjid structures, and to create what the Israeli government wishes to create, which is a space that's not so much sacred. I mean, this is the Kotel. It's great sacred importance to Jews all over the world, for sure. But to create a place that was an open, what they call the Western Wall Plaza, which is an open area that not only is a site of worship. This is the marking for the synagogue, the open-air synagogue. By the way, never gender segregated until Israel took over in '67. Here's the women's section, and there's the men's section. But this area beyond the synagogue, which is also used for a variety. So let me just show you that this is one more. This is the former arrangement, and this is the new the Western Wall Plaza, now about 46, 47 years old. This is the space that existed before the Kotel and the Moroccan Quarter, which was called for hundreds of years, and Jews did pray there, and Jews who predate Zionism, who lived in the city well before 48 or before the rise of political Zionism, prayed there. Here's some slides of the destructions in the days and actually hours after the 135 Palestinian structures were destroyed. And this was all intended to make way for a grand celebration celebrating what the Israelis say called the liberation of Jerusalem. And the space to this day is used for scenes like this. I think this is on Jerusalem Day. Tens of thousands of people make their way to the wall, which is both a national and religio-national space meant to stoke and build nationalist ideas and ideologies. Let me just speak about something more contemporary, and I'll zoom through this very quickly. I'll maybe take questions about Martin Buber and his experience after in the question and answer session. There's an area of Jerusalem that Israel wishes to, the Israeli state has made its claim on, called E1, which is just east of the boundaries of the old city, of East Jerusalem. And it includes settlements, it will include, if it's encircled, an extension of the settlement of Ma'ale Adumim, built in the 70s. And about 15 or 20 years ago, a population who was living on land that Israel wishes to appropriate and include within the wall as part of its expanded, broadened capital, are a group of Bedouin communities, generally very poor, who live on this land but who are gradually being expelled. This area is an Area C. And in the late 90s, they finally were packed up and gotten rid of so that the settlement could expand, in one case, a kindergarten for the settler children. And these marginal fringe communities are indeed, in the strict sense of the word, subaltern communities. That is, they are outside of any form of government services. They are marginal not only, of course, to Israeli society, but also to Palestinian society as well. And I'm not aware of the Palestinian Authority ever making any particular great campaign on their behalf. They have mostly, and these individuals, this community and others, have been relocated in the Israeli parlance to near an Israeli municipal garbage dump. And that is where, to this day, they are. Their land has been appropriated, and they have been indeed put where one puts the dirt or the filth or the pollution, those who pollute a body politic that does not want them and regards them as dangerous. And I'm giving the warning time. So let me just conclude with that, and we can take up questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
What is the actual history of the Western Wall? As far as I know, Jews did not pray there until the 1500s when the Mamelukes, it was too dangerous to pray outside, the walls of Jerusalem. So the Mamelukes allowed them to pray there. So it really wasn't an ancient prayer site, and someone's made it the #1 site for Jews in the world. But isn't that solely by default, that there's no other extant site in Jerusalem? And okay.
I'm not a historian of Judaism, but my understanding is that there were alternative sites of prayer, and that this site, as being the primary site within Judaism, many have suggested, historians like Peters at NYU, that it is, not quite a modern invention, but an invention of relatively recent construction. To me, it doesn't matter that much, because so many of these religious ideas or histories are themselves invented. Surely it can't be used to justify either the ethnic cleansing of the Moroccan Quarter or of parts of West Jerusalem or East Jerusalem. I've heard that. I guess I just don't know quite enough. I've been told that there were places on Mount Zion and areas on the Mount of Olives where prayer was much more commonly engaged in until the 15th, 16th century. But that's what I know. Yeah, but again, whether it's true or not, whether these are actually the western walls of the Herodian temple, to my mind doesn't matter that much, provided it's not used as a device to justify the expropriation of other people's land. I don't personally, I wanted to emphasize, I don't personally have a problem with these myths. I have a problem with them weaponized. It's not, for the believers in the room, it's not a critique of the sacred. It's a critique of the way the sacred is used by human beings to exploit and colonize and enslave other people, or kill off other people. Yeah.
Hi, Tom. I'm so happy I was able to make the talk today, and this is probably the most important topic to me, the idea of Jerusalem. So as somebody who studied culture anthropology and had a fascinating and very deep love for the study, what have you learned from the holistic sort of micro stories? For example, my fiance and I were working on researching sort of these micro instances of destruction and reappropriation. One of them was the bus terminal in East Jerusalem, which was actually used by Israelis to come from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now it's being used by West Bankers to come to Jerusalem. So it's kind of flipped on its head. But what is sort of the holistic lesson that you've learned from these sort of micro stories?
I hope I've learned something. In the course of doing this kind of research, what you certainly learn is very quickly is how little you know. Was that on the microphone? You realize how little you know, but also you understand the importance of really listening more than you talk and asking questions that are, if deemed irrelevant to the people you're asking them, to shift and talk about what they, for instance, think is important. This is a methodology that doesn't rely on survey questions or ironclad sort of, passing out surveys, I'm going to go get a coffee, I'll swing back around and pick them up and take them away. It's about real engagement with human beings and understanding their quotidian dimensions of struggle and fear and trauma. So many of these things that I don't pretend to have any great grasp on. But I know enough to know that, for instance, say within the politics of home demolitions in the city, many tens of thousands of Palestinians live in structures that Israel deems illegal and therefore are slated for destruction and can be destroyed week to week, month to month. They've been served, many have served demolition orders. Those soldiers who destroy the home could come at any time. And imagine living with the kind of trauma associated with that. Knowing that it probably won't have, there's so many illegal homes, Israel can't actually, where resistance is important, they don't actually have the resources to destroy all of the homes. But when you talk to people who live in them, some 3-pack-a-day smokers, not knowing that all they have, their livelihood, will be taken from them, it creates real kinds of forms of sadness and trauma that aren't easily measured and that can really only be gotten to by talking to people and listening. That's what I would say about that now. Yes, Salim, or Professor Tamari.
Thank you, Professor Abowd, for a most stimulating talk. I want to ask you something about the real estate market in patterns of reversed processes to the one that you described. And here I'm asking you about the way in which rental
Yes.
plots and mortgages are being purchased by Palestinians from Israel, but also from the West Bank in areas like Neve Yaakov and French Hill. I mean, would you consider this a reversing process to what's happening? Do you think it will undermine the Israeli project for segregation, or do you think it's just it's a fart in the wind?
Okay, I think I understand the metaphor. Professor Tamari is referring to a range of, I wish I have the map, but basically East Jerusalem Jewish settlements, some of which, like French Hill, Ramot, Neve Yaakov, have been there for 35, 40 years. Entire generations of Israeli settlers have grown up there. And because some of the housing stock is not particularly attractive, there are nicer places for settlers to be subsidized. People are moving out of a place. Jewish settlers are moving out and either renting to, or if some of them, the units have been privatized, selling to Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's important to understand with regard to Israeli land law, though, that this is very difficult. Israel is not, being an Israeli citizen, a Palestinian-Israeli citizen, citizen of Israel, does not grant you rights by the terms of the JNF, which you know. But as I understand, there are on the fringes ways to subvert that. So for instance, some of these settlements have neighborhoods or sub-neighborhoods where there's private development. And in Israel doesn't exclude private development. Or I'm sorry, it doesn't exclude the sale of private residences, which is why they've classified 90% of roughly the country as public or state land, so they can regulate it more efficiently and prevent the sale. But you're right. In fact, in the last 10 years, there have been hundreds of Palestinians, mostly citizens of 48 from the Galilee, who are moving in. I'm not familiar with many buying. My understanding is they're mostly renting long-term or subletting from a sympathetic Israeli landlord. But reversing it, I don't know. That's an open question. I think the Palestinians will have to answer that one. I don't think it will be allowed to. I don't think the Israeli state will allow that sort of reversal. But yeah, it's an open question. Other questions? Oh, one from the
We
director.
have a,
Yes. Oh, a
no,
tweet.
not from me. It's a tweet. Is this on, actually? This is a question from our online audience. And it's, she would like to know the story, more about the story of the various homes that Martin Buber lived in while he was in Jerusalem.
Okay, I'm sorry, it's my fault too, I've taken more time, but I want to just tell you that, as I mentioned before, Buber first fled Germany, lost his job, Nazis dispossessed him. He came to Palestine in '38, and the first home he moved into was the home of the rented the home of the Edward Said family, and then moved from there to another home, the Dejani home in another Palestinian, largely neighborhood. But in '48, '49, this man who had always been a champion of binationalism and against the Jewish state, but for a homeland, and who was really quite, if you read his letters, which I've read a lot of his published English letters, he was a deeply humane guy. I think he was serious about cooperation and coexistence. He just couldn't he couldn't sort of disentangle himself from the broader colonial venture that this project was a part of. But in '49, in making his peace with the creation of the State of Israel and understanding the new laws that were being put into place and the refugee issues, he was given or allowed to purchase a home from a Palestinian family, the Sununu family, who were dispossessed in '48, who fled the country, and their home was taken. And Buber, knowing it was a Palestinian property, and he did know, and I've talked to his relatives, his grandchildren, they knew, and they lived in the house until his death in '65, and this is the house. Buber would go on to critique Ben-Gurion's policies of land expropriation in the Galilee, the massacres that took place early on in the state. There were lots of his letters that were published that in which he and Ben-Gurion were really clearly at odds. But despite the fact that he condemned the Israeli state policy of taking land and homes elsewhere, he never was, as far as I could I mean, he lived in the home. He chose to live there. He could have lived other places. And he lived in this home. This home, interestingly, as I understand from the grandchild, so the family inherited the Sununu house. Sununu being, famous in this town as the former governor of New Hampshire, former chief of staff to Bush the father. And this family is still trying to find a way to try to fight for the return of this property, which, by the way, in conclusion, is now, I understand, owned and inhabited by the major bankroller of Birthright Israel, I believe a guy named Steiner, Michael Steiner, who resides there now and is doing some creative renovations, I'm sure. So that's, in a nutshell, the story of Buber and binationalism of that ilk.
Thanks. Is this on? Yeah. Thanks. This is really wonderful work and a wonderful book. And
Thank you.
it's wonderful that somebody is boldly framing this the way it should be framed.
Thank you.
But speaking of that, I just wondered about your reaction to something that Rashid Khalidi once said, which is talking about, normally you conceptualize colonialism, there's a center and a periphery. And Rashid has said that the center of the Israeli colonial project is in the United States, that it's actually not in Israel, it's here. And I'm not sure how he would describe that, but I mean, we're not just talking about AIPAC or American Jews. In fact, American Jews are becoming more and more fractured over this issue. But evangelical Christians, and during the Cold War, the military defense establishment. A military officer once described to me in the 80s, he said, Israel is our aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. I mean, that this isn't just, it's not as simplistic as just AIPAC, but this is really a colonial project that's being, the center of which is not there. And I wonder, to the degree, the time you spent in Jerusalem, do you feel, you just mentioned Michael Steiner owning this house, I mean, or the Wiesenthal Center funding the museum. I mean, is that, how much do you sense, is that palpable, that the degree to which this project is funded or centered or driven elsewhere? Many people have different views on this. My sense is that the real critical population and country in this, there cannot be a settlement of this conflict that's remotely just until the U.S. government changes its policies. The whole international community, it's like South Africa 40 years ago. South Africans are very clear that, as long as we have the United States and Nixon and Johnson on our side, we can weather this European, the social movements. So, yeah, I think that until, my view, and maybe Rashid or others have other views, but I don't think anything will happen, including full or partial decolonization of Palestinian land, until the United States puts pressure and stops providing not just money but moral sanction. And you're right, it's more than AIPAC. There are other communities here. It's not the Jewish lobby. That's wrong to suggest, which you're right to suggest. There are other forces that have an interest, like the arms industry, that so much of the aid to Israel comes right back to Lockheed Martin, right? They love foreign aid, that sort of foreign aid. So that's my short answer to a very complex question, yes. But an important one. I believe you're the father of a student of mine. By the name of Noah Habib. Which is why I read the book.
Oh, very sweet. See, these students are the light of our lives, yes. Great.
Do we have any more questions? Can I ask one? Can I ask the last one?
Surely. Do you want
So in this book, you talk a lot about, colonialism, obviously, and Palestinians segregated in this larger community, in this sort of larger prison. And in a way, I'm thinking about it a lot in a very political way, but you also include in your book lots of anecdotes about everyday life, about the experiences of real people, and that's what I found really compelling about your book. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about these experiences, and the checkpoint, not the checkpoints, but everything else, the sort of the demarcation of everybody's life in every way.
Right. Well, thank you for the question. It's a very good one. I didn't want to give you too much ethnographic detail, but in fact, as I mentioned before with regard to housing, the traumas and the experiences of degradation and humiliation are really immense. These things don't show up often in human rights reports, the names of people, mothers who give birth at checkpoints because the Israelis will not let them come in. And I understand, I don't have the citation for this, but I understand, more than a few children have died at these checkpoints. I think there's a study done by Amnesty, but at any rate, the pain associated with it, the humiliation of a man taking his sick mother who's going to die if she doesn't get into Jerusalem, being turned back by some 18-year-old soldier and treated like garbage. And with his mother dying, there's a case that OSHA documented of his mother's dying in the back and the soldiers opening the back seat where the mother is dying and like looking around looking for bombs. That kind of, these things are in many ways immeasurable. Certainly not quantitatively measurable very easily, and they have human, deep, sort of rooted impact on people's psyche, on trauma. The little studied, Diana Butto, who's here, is doing work on youth labor. The impact on children as they experience violence from very scary sort of settlers and soldiers is understudied and underwritten to my knowledge, and it really should be, because these kind of everyday daily lived impacts is creating a havoc that I don't think if most Israelis knew this that they would support it. I really don't, and I don't think most Americans, if they knew this, would tolerate it for an instant. Which is why you need mystification, which is why you need ideology, which is why you need the weaponization of myth. But we can talk at greater length. I know but thank you for the question.
I think
We're all done. Okay. Thank you for coming, everyone.